Father Dr. David and I have been friends for more than 20 years and will continue for more than that, my hope is. And he's joining us here today in a really moment of complexity. Pope Francis passed away yesterday, and we're very sorry for that global loss, and real community spirit is lost. And I'm sure David will say some words about that as well. But just to give you a little bit more of an orientation, one of the reasons why we wanted David to join us today is David has been really involved in a very intentional exploration of how to grow a mission-filled, a spirit-filled encounter with the complexity that the Catholic Church has been facing and will continue to face, of course, particularly now. And I've had the great pleasure of working with him in some of the parts of this work. And this work has continued to grow and flourish, and really matter in a way and make a difference that really is mattering to the church right now. So I'm very excited about having David speak to us directly about his experience and what he's learning, and how he and his collaborators and his team are meeting the complexity of the time. So it is without any further ado, I guess, that I welcome my beloved and dear friend David to share his insights and learnings and experiences with us today. So thank you.
Thanks, Aliki. The love is mutual, as you know, and I'm also grateful to see friends here on the call, people I've known over the years since the work, either at Teachers College or since then, including at UGA at various moments. I'm going to try to limit my comments to about a half hour or so, so that we also leave time for some reflection and triads, and then time for Q&A. So that's the idea. If I start to go on too long, I know that Aliki will use the cane and pull me off stage. So if if as we enter into this, though, you have questions, you have things that you'd like to get clarified, I would hate to just be talking ad nauseum without the opportunity to clarify things that you might have real questions about. Yeah, really, it is a delight to see people I didn't expect to see on this call. So thanks so much for showing up. I realize that the context that I'm going to be talking about today may not be a familiar one to many of you. Some of you might even have allergic reactions to exploring issues related to the Catholic Church for a whole variety of reasons. I understand that being associated with the church, which has had terrible scandals over the years, and such a spotty history can stir up reactions from people. What I'm hoping is that it really feels like a mirror of reality as it is, with our human condition messy, filled with lights and shadows, and the organization, right, of the church with all of its complexity over the course of more than 2,000 years is an interesting object lesson, right, for how a very human, at times very broken institution can nonetheless continue through a history and continue to have a life that regenerates itself over time. And in fact, it's not just regenerated just willy-nilly. There's something that's happening through people who are taking responsibility for the mission, for the way in which this mission is exercised in diverse ways all around the world. So that's a little preamble for us. Okay. I run a leadership development program, for lack of a better word, but it's very comprehensive here in Rome. I'll tell a little bit of the story behind how this program was founded and why. And again, I'll give you a little bit of a glimpse into our content and methodology. which is very much about trying to help senior leaders in the church, in a sense, meet and also transcend many of the challenges that we face today, many of these complex challenges. I'll say also at the outset, many of you know a lot more about complexity theory than I do. It's not my principal base or my principal lens. So I just say that because you'll have a lot more to share about these things than I will. Okay, I'm going to jump into some slides if that's okay. So I'll share my screen. And I'm going to shift to a different view. Okay. Can everybody see the slides? Okay. So we're called the Discerning Leadership Program. And this picture is actually taken from 2019 when we ran the program for the first time. And it was our pilot of the program. You'll see in this picture clergy and women religious and lay people from all around the world who are headquartered here in Rome. And the title of the program, Formation for a Synodal Church. What is synodality? We'll talk about that as we move into the presentation. The purpose of our program, right? We exist to build the capacity for senior leaders in the Catholic Church, specifically headquartered here in Rome, but also internationally, to really meet the complexities of our times, and so to serve the Catholic Church and society through this change of eras. I think most of us on this call know that we're not just living through a time of change, but a change of times, like literally a change of epoch. And just as those poor penguins on the icebergs up in the North and the South Poles, it feels like the ice is gradually melting out from underneath us. We're more and more in these liquid times. And the church has been through very liquid times in the past, but perhaps not to this level of complexity because of our global nature and because of the rapid pace of change. So accompanying leaders through this time is really our principal purpose, and creating spaces for leaders to reflect not just on their practice, but in their practice about how they're leading through this time. Here is a recent cohort of participants who have gone through our Module 3. This is a module on leadership for organizational change. And you'll see that most of them are women religious. And this might be a surprise to many of you who know the Catholic Church for being a patriarchal, organization over the last 2,000 years, one with a male hierarchy. But you probably wouldn't be surprised to know that it's many women around the world who are the most interested in learning and growing and adapting to these very, very challenging times that we're living in. The women who are in this photo are from many religious orders that are international in nature. They're here coming through a program where they bring case studies to us as a team, and we work through them with companionship and support and inputs. But I really wanted to emphasize that the church has always relied really on women to be at the foundation of carrying on this mission of the gospel and carrying out the mission in also often very difficult circumstances without recognition, without resources. Women are really the heroes of the story of the church, and too often neglected for their incredible contribution. As we focus, though, on a few words on this slide, to lead an evolving church in a synodal and discerning manner. So what is synodality? Over the last 4 years, Pope Francis has called the church to retrieve a very ancient concept, really the practice that major decisions of the church should be made together. They should be made together in a consensual way, introducing prayer and periods of reflection and listening to sort through diverse opinions, to overcome conflicts, to find ways to harmonize the diversity of views, and to do so in a way that doesn't leave anyone behind. The church had a very early tradition of doing this in the first few centuries. This lasted into the Middle Ages. And then it was in the late Middle Ages where things started to come apart again. So synodality literally is to be on the road together. And if you think about the organizations and the communities in which we live, to convey what it means to be on the road together these days might be difficult because of our polarization, because of the level of fragmentation in our societies. And as an American, I would say our individualism, for those of us who are American, is really very much playing against this being on the road together. So the way that it's defined in the documents of the church these days is that it's a walking together of Christians, right? Those who espouse Christ as the heart of our faith, walking in union with all of humanity, non-exclusively, with peoples of other faiths and people without faith, people who are of goodwill, and those who are striving in their own ways for their own sense of the good. But in simple and concise terms, synodality is a path of spiritual and structural renewal and for reform, enabling the church to be more participatory and missionary. So what is synodality, this initiative of Pope Francis trying to address? The way in which hierarchy and power from a top-down perspective have often squashed the diverse involvement of peoples, especially at the local levels of church. And rather, he's trying to create a space wherein this whole mindset of hierarchy can be overturned to increase participation without losing the role of hierarchy for making things happen, recruiting resources and things like that. But this is more than an organizational change process. It's really intended to revitalize the heart of the mission, and as Pope Francis has hopefully, made so clear to the whole world, it's about very simply serving people with love, with compassion, with mercy. It's about being open, especially to those who are most vulnerable. It's really about serving a greater good and doing so with humility, rather than a sense that we have the superior culture or we have all the answers, but really to do so in a way that's humbly walking with others. This synodality played out, well, in practice is not so easy. This scene from above is actually a scene from the ending of the synod last year in October. I participated in both synods and was involved at a kind of global level with the development of several commissions and documents. This looks a little bit like a Christmas tree, in fact, but these are rows of bishops and cardinals. And if you can imagine from a complexity point of view, the architectural complexity that we're dealing with here of bureaucracy, something that the Roman Empire was brilliant at developing as a way of managing the tremendous reach of the empire. But this bureaucracy, for all of its strengths of organizing resources and creating standardization, is also completely stifling of creativity and innovation. And So the question of how to maintain an appropriate measure of hierarchy, but at the same time really move into this way of organizing itself and structuring the flow of authority in a much more participatory style. So in previous synods, where the church had to make major decisions about important doctrinal issues, think about that line of popes and cardinals, or the cardinals and bishops essentially all facing forward to a raised dais with a pope and several senior cardinals on the stage. And most of those synods in the past were very perfunctory. There were decisions made prior to everyone, gathering. But over the last 2 years, this has been the model of synod, not just cardinals and bishops, but the whole people of God invited to come forth, lay women and men, clergy, religious, lay, people from every corner of the earth, gathering around tables to pray and to discern together, and to determine really how the Holy Spirit, this sense of this mysterious force we believe to be God's active agency and presence with us in the world, how this is actually drawing us toward the future and inviting us to co-create with our own agency and responsibility that future for a common good. This process involves a lot more than just organizing, resources around tables. It's also about creating a culture of deep listening, of prayerful reflection, of discerning. And I use this word in a particular way, discerning and sifting through the various thoughts and feelings that come up for each of us individually and collectively, so that we can find a common path forward that includes all of our interests. So the synod is not a democratic process. It's not a parliamentary process. It's in fact intending to go beyond that level of participation and involve people at a deeper level of personal accountability. There's a lot, I'm sure, that I would need to unpack to explain all that further, but I'm going to keep going to see if we can, let's see, go to the next slide here. So this is the scene just from 2 blocks away from my house, in fact. Right now it's thronged with people who are here, not just celebrating Easter, but now mourning for Pope Francis. In fact, the piazza in front of St. Peter's is filled with people in prayer who are remembering him and praying for the church at this time. The church, as you know, for 2 millennia has stood and it has a kind of centrality, a central governance system that is immediately identifiable. It's given it a kind of unity and coherence for the better part of these 2,000 years, along with a tremendous amount of diversity. And the church often has established that unity in a top-down way by suppressing heresies and by suppressing diversity of thought and trying to strive for a homogeneity of belief, a kind of orthodoxy in a sense of what we believe. That's true. And at the same time, the church has always been involved in dialogue and a lively tension with people pushing against those boundaries of belief and pressing for new ways of thinking. And this dynamism, this dynamic complexity, is not something that the church has always managed so well. But nonetheless, it has remained intact and alive, largely because of this unity, this sort of coherence that's given because it's replicating a kind of uniformity. But that's not the whole story. The whole story of the church is one of tremendous diversity. This is just one scene of facilitators and theologians and participants from the synod. Those people gathered around, the tables in the synod hall, just down the block. And the question really of synodality, one of them, is not only how to balance hierarchy and participation, it's also to find the unity in the diversity of the church. This requires a tremendous capacity for complexity, for patience and tolerance of, conflict, of the possibility of, contentious views in relationship to each other, and to follow the path of that relationship and that sense of what does bring us together in common ground, to hold us together as we build relationship and foster this capacity, increasingly, to make decisions in common with one another. So those are the two primary polarities I would like to suggest are at play in the synod process. When we were gathered for the synod, it began with a process of data collection from churches all over the world in 2021 into 2022. That data was gradually gathered and synthesized at various levels within the church, at continental levels and then globally. I had the great privilege of being part of that process, not only of creating the data collection methods, but also of being there when the continental reports were brought together, and we were trying to sort through the incredible spectrum of people's experiences globally, but also to discern what were the kind of common shadows and lights that we needed to foreground in this process, because these would then be shaping the agenda for the first in-person gathering of the synod in October of 2023. And during that synod process, there was a style of engagement that allowed us to deepen the ways in which we together were individually and collectively praying through these deep questions. At the heart of all this is really this way in which the notion of hierarchy, which is so conventional for us, with the laity at the bottom and the Pope at the top, this kind of old monarchical view, was being flipped. And the question for many church leaders is, well, what does it mean for me to be in service of the laity in this way? And no longer to see oneself, at the top of a clerical kind of world, a clerical mindset of ordination entitling us to a special perspective or a special authority. This was incredibly disorienting to many participants, and more so for some participants from certain parts of the globe where tradition, hierarchy, patriarchy are so taken for granted that to even begin to conceive of something different is almost beyond people's imagination. A lot of complexity. But as we moved into this process, there were certain inspirations that people began to find in this way of making decisions inclusively. People experienced the way in which, as the church was moving in this direction, the inclusive decision-making style was animating and motivating for people to invest themselves more fully. That the collaboration balancing hierarchy enriched the quality of thinking and the scope of people's creativity. That active listening is no small thing, and that most of us don't do it well. But to realize that as the church moves from a church that is all about teaching to one that is also listening, the value for the whole church is that it's closer in relationship to the realities that people are living. And this way of listening and speaking better balances the role of the church in the world. A church that has certain answers and truths that it proclaims, and at the same time is always on a journey and in process. And again, Pope Francis, his emphasis on listening has really had a profound inspirational effect, I think, on many Catholic leaders. This idea of flexibility and adaptability, which is not so easy for a bureaucratic organization that has this much history. But people could see the value of this really radical change from sitting in rows with ourselves all facing in one direction, listening in translation, but not really having a chance for real active dialogue, to move to round tables. It may seem like such a small thing to those of us who are educators, but if you can appreciate how radical this was for people to walk into the Paul VI Hall and see these round tables and to see that they had, the princes of the church seated around tables with patriarchs, literally patriarchs from the Eastern Christian churches, alongside a laywoman from, in my case, at the table I was sitting, a laywoman, a single mom from Papua New Guinea, who never could have imagined herself having a voice at that level. So there's something really radical that's happening in terms of how change, by virtue of the church's openness, flexibility, and adaptability, is actually taking place. A lot more, from my perspective, my humble perspective, it has to happen. But nonetheless, we're on the way. The empowerment of individuals, and just to use the example of my friend from Papua New Guinea, to find her voice at the table and to be able to push back at the view, for instance, of a cardinal coming from another part of the world that seemed to really dismiss the view of a layperson not ordained. She pushed back, and because of her theological education and her own authenticity, she was heard, and it changed the mood at the table. This again it's an amazing thing to witness, and as small as it might sound, it's a sign of the possibility that a structure as old and as big as the Catholic Church can actually be in process, be in motion. Community building, the way in which relationships must precede the tasks, and the focus on things as simple as friendship and family and community became like the common language amongst us, gathered from all over the world, but with a sense that at the heart of things, what we value are the human things, the simple things, and that this became common ground in very important ways, even if the ways we define family are different, even if the ways in which we think about friendship are different. Basic concepts, human concepts, and relationship at the core. A kind of intentional engagement with diversity. One of the great challenges in corporations and also in the church is imposing a kind of professional pastoral culture on everyone that doesn't make space except to acknowledge there's diversity. But it doesn't actually, in a sense, reverence that diversity and harness it as an asset and see it really as not just an instrumental asset, but actually the expression of the way God works in the world, which is through our incredible breadth of difference. The focus on discernment, so that we're not talking simply about problem solving or inventing new initiatives, but discernment is really about trying to follow a path that will lead to greater flourishing in life. Sometimes that means pruning. Sometimes that means, moving in a direction that involves taking on sacrifice. But discernment is basically this invitation, an ontological, epistemological, and moral invitation to a particular way of living and being, and relating in the world, one where we're more connected to the interior life and how through our movements of affect and energy, we're connected to something beyond ourselves, God, our neighbor, the earth, and led in many ways to make better decisions on the basis of those connections. What is discernment helping us to do is to overcome the limits of our egos, the attachments that we often fall subject to, which limit our views and often lead us to biased decision making. This cultivation of discernment is at the heart of this move that Pope Francis is inviting us into. Sustaining the dialogue even when it's hard, and finally, really building this resilient long-term capacity for the service of the mission. Okay, so it's one of those funny group shots that we all have at the end of a conference, right? When everybody gathers and you try to fit everybody into the frame. But really, for us, this image of all of us gathered on the last day of the synod, when a document was read out and voted upon, it felt like a small miracle had taken place. This was the culmination of several years of listening and praying and trying to come to consensus. What were the fruits of it? Well, some people say that the most important fruits of this process were simply the friendships that emerged. But others would say, no, there's concrete changes that the church has made regarding canon law, and regarding certain provisions it's making for inclusion, for ensuring that everyone will have a voice through councils and other processes in the church. So it's not a small thing. Okay, I know I'm a little bit behind Aliki, so I need maybe 5 more minutes, if you can give it to me. So a few more things. Discerning leadership is a way of proceeding. We are trying to foster this leadership capacity to do this kind of very complex work of change at a global level by really supporting leaders with an ecology of learning. So we know that best practice says it's not enough to send people through even a very deep residential program that happens over the course of a few weeks, that we also need lots of other ways of, in a sense, fostering the seeds of growth. That involves accompaniment by coaches. It involves consultation at times by organizational experts. We send weekly emails out to people where they're invited to reflect on the intersection of the gospel and leadership, for instance. We do webinars. We do webinars in territory that you'd find a little bit unusual. For instance, many of the religious leaders that we work with are working with organizational members or populations, distressed and vulnerable populations that have experienced trauma. We reached out to a partner with Thomas Hübl, who's an international expert in this area of working with trauma. And the leaders in our program had the chance to really get accompaniment through his organization as they're facing, for instance, the civil war in Myanmar, or the challenges between ethnic rivalries in a part of Congo, which is now really experiencing a resurgence of violence. So we offer this ecology of learning to really help our leaders to transform themselves and their organizations over time. Our methodology, we don't come as experts, but as well-informed amateurs working together with our participants. It's very important for us to create this sense of a sacred space so that when people are in our seminars or even in the online space, we're not just listening passively. We're paying attention to how, in this very moment, you or I feel connected to one another, to the topic at hand, to the sense that there's a spirit at work amongst us that wants our good, wants the flourishing, right, of our species, wants the kind of the common good to be fostered and advanced. So this sacred space creates safe space for people to bring their vulnerabilities, express their limits, um, share where, and especially in the case of our leaders, they're struggling with loneliness or um, the kind of sense of being fraudulent, of not being up to the task and being really advanced beyond their abilities. These are things that are just normal for leaders, but unless they're given the space to talk about these things, it's very difficult to actually take in the deep lessons and learn. Process is as important as content. This is something that Aliki in her research found as she accompanied our participants. The way in which the team exercises its own learning in public and facilitates learning in a way that's very dynamic and engaged, but also very open to being challenged and really bringing our own transformation as educators and facilitators into the mix. We really see that adult development is at the heart of what we're trying to do, but we don't engage it um, head on, which can really intimidate our participants. Rather, we do it in a very gentle and kind of oblique ways. And as I said, the accompaniment by coaches has been a critical part of our work. We really try to cultivate this sense of discernment as an attitude, an inner attitude. We see capacity and competence going hand in hand. And we're very interested in these generative spaces where our collective intelligence can effervesce. And what are the conditions that leaders can put in place to help those spaces in their own organizations? So I'm going to really just give you a sense. The first week of our residential content is largely focused on the fostering of the individual as a discerning leader. How do we exercise power? How do we see our call to service and responsibility in a vocational sense? What are some practices that help to heighten our self-awareness, which we see as critical? Okay. How do we help people to engage their vulnerabilities in really, I'd say, safe, but also really generative ways? Our second week is really focused on the interpersonal work of teams and organizations. And we explore these questions from intercultural competence perspectives, managing of polarities, dealing with conflict styles, case studies. So these residential weeks are quite intense. They happen here in Rome. We have 3 languages that we work in. So there's 3 distinct editions, English, Spanish, and Italian. Our highest level work right now is with the number 2s in the Vatican. They're called secretaries, but their roles are really as COOs of each of the Vatican dicasteries. And we've also been working outside of Rome. We've been in India twice, have worked with about 150 church leaders there, and also in Asia Pacific. And our program continues to grow through both in-person and online work. I'm going to finish with one last input here. In the synod process, and for organizations trying to help to move in the direction of this model of balancing hierarchy and participation, we use a method called conversation in the spirit. And I would say it's possible to use this in secular contexts without introducing the spirituality. It's richer, I think, if we're able to claim the roots of our inspiration, but I think it can also be translated into a context that's mission driven, for instance. And this method is used to ponder and then potentially to make decisions about important matters where there might be a great diversity of opinions. And it's a way of helping the group move from a collection of individuals into a discerning body, a collective, or a real community, and then to find a pattern within the community that represents really the movement of the collective spirit in the direction of something new, something, for instance, an important organizational initiative or change. This process involves three steps. First of all, clarifying the question that you want to ponder. Recently, working with a university that's Catholic and Jesuit, they're very conscious that in their recruitment of students, that flying the Catholic flag, hasn't been very successful, and yet at the same time, they're very worried about losing the value proposition created by their distinct identity as Catholic and Jesuit. And their question for the Board of Trustees was whether and how, to market themselves. So it's a very instrumental but strategic question. So, what are the conditions we want to put in place? Well, this method helps us to come together as a body, not just a bunch of people who are trying to make their own voice heard, but as a community with a common stake, to develop trust and listening, which requires time to build relationships. To create a space where the elephants can be named, the hard issues can be put on the table, and people can do it because there's something bigger than our own personal feelings at stake. The idea that, in fact, alternate perspectives are valued more than groupthink. And so the idea that, in a sense, we're trying to create a reflective atmosphere where diverse perspectives can be heard with respect and where the greater good is clear, which allows us to put our agendas in the back seat, especially if we trust that a really good process will hold our interests and our agenda, even as we sort through something that is for the greater good. Would that our contemporary political, processes could do something similar? We draw inspiration from Otto Scharmer's work here around the different levels of listening. I won't go into these in any length, but draw your attention to them as a resource if you haven't already really explored the work of the Presencing Institute. Otto's a friend and also a collaborator, and we've introduced another feature to this map of the different forms of listening to include the contemplative, because for us, this is a kind of key dimension of how we're listening, not just to thoughts and feelings within ourselves or to the group, but also trying to really attend to the something more, this sense of the transcendent. This is really what is necessary for that generativity to come out of this complexity. The first round is to slow people down to take time for personal reflection about the important questions that they have to ponder. We never do the process unless people have a half an hour to an hour or more to really consider these questions prior to entering into a sharing process. In round one, if you can imagine a group of 6 or 8 people, and each person has the chance to each share from their own perspective what is real, what is true for them from their reflection. This was a tradition known to indigenous peoples for millennia. And many communities use this. The Quakers, for instance, use this methodology as well. But each person speaks for a very short period of time, offering what's been prepared, and everyone else's task is to listen and to feel within themselves what is resonating or not with what's shared. It's to listen as if one were a mirror trying to really reflect the reality of the other person, or like a bell really attentive to vibrations, right? After each person has the chance to share once with a little bit of silence in between, there's a second round, which helps us to move from that collection of individuals to really being a body as we not repeat what we said before, but we actually build on what we heard others share, saying, this is what resonated with me and why. And this connects people at a deeper level. It builds the sense of empathy, which then deepens trust and allows for the beginning of a consensus to emerge in the third round. This process of going around and actively listening and reflecting back what we've heard, which is what has resonated with us, helps the group to develop a kind of intimacy and a sense of trust. And finally, in round 3, very importantly, the group sits back, in a sense, to attend to the common experience, the shared experience, and to pay attention to the points of convergence and divergence. What were the elements that were especially filled with energy for people? And these are really the things that we want to pay special attention to, not a summary of everything that's been heard or said. This round 3 often leads to the shaping of some content to be offered to a larger plenary. And this is where we enter into kind of more of a systemic sense making, where small groups, part of a larger whole, have the chance to each offer their own piece of insight, of imagination for forward movement. Okay, I'm stopping here, and I'm just going to invite you to a few moments of quiet to consider these 3 questions before triads, and then we'll have at least 15 minutes for a triad, if not more, before a plenary. So maybe we could just take a few minutes and consider, what were the inner movements of thought and feeling that you had as you were listening to this presentation? Are there any meaningful connections that you make to the content or the process? And is there anything that you could see yourself applying in your own context? Okay. So maybe we could take, say, three minutes for this, and then Young-Hoon will put us into triads where we can have a conversation for Young-Hoon, let's say 15 minutes.
Okay.
I realize too that this would normally be a great time for clarifying questions, but I have a feeling that we'd get so wrapped up in clarifying questions, we wouldn't get you to have small group conversations. So we'll leave those if we can.
David.
Yes.
I wonder if you could take the questions and also copy them into the chat.
Sure.
Thank you.
I know that won't be enough time for especially the introverts in our crowd, but maybe we can head off into small groups for now, and then we'll see you back on the other side in about 16 minutes or so. Welcome back. By the way, Justine, Shaquila, Julie, my goodness, it's Allie. So nice to see you, Ellen. Okay, and Rita, my gosh, it's been ages. Very nice to see you all. Listen, in this time we have left, we've got about 20 minutes. The space is open. I would propose that maybe each of you, from your triads, gives us some sense of what was percolating in your conversations. But you may have questions that you also want to explore. What's most alive for you? And feel free to.
Oh, I was just going to jump right in. I love the connection to my triad. We all had a background in churches that were structured. And so that was really interesting. But the things that we took away, building community, that piece was really important. Also giving that voice. And I know for myself as a member of the church, hoping that what you are creating here really is able to be transferred over. I feel it where I am at the University of Georgia because we have a really progressive atmosphere, but 1 hour down the road, we have literally the opposite, unfortunately. And so I also work in adult education. And so everything that you've said here has just been the kinds of things that resonate with me and my group. We had a very, very similar connection, and I really enjoyed it getting to meet them. So thank you for this space.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Our group was just so rich and energizing. The notes are too long for the 20 minutes that we have, but just two things that stood out for me was, not just walking together, but making that journey an exchange of gifts. Teresa brought that concept to the table. And then, really bringing both and thinking, polarity management, embracing paradox to the heart of this. Shifting the frame from what's the problem to be solved to what are we trying to discern.
Yeah. Great, Matthew. Thank you very much. Yeah. As you know, in the adult development field, helping people to make space for both and thinking is really the beginning of that movement toward dialectical complexity. And if we don't have that, we feel very fragile and defensive when we meet difference. So it becomes, in a sense, an imperative for us to support people in moving that direction, so as to avoid polarization, violence, othering, scapegoating, all these things. So how about others?
Thank you, David, for this amazing talk and conversation here. We talked about just in terms of the inner movements, I think we were both reflecting on where we are personally, but in our current contexts and how that informs, what was moving in us. There was a conversation about just hearing this work elicited a sense of longing for this kind of intimacy in public space, I think, in a way to do work, because we were recognizing that in the current times, people are either hiding or fighting. That was the sort of polarity that was brought up. The other thing too that I'll own, that attention that I'm holding that you brought up multiple times that I would love to hear more about too, is this tension between hierarchy and participation, because I'm seeing that people talking about the only way to have participation or unity and diversity is through flatness or sameness and no hierarchy. And I loved how you kind of talked about the pitfalls and benefits of hierarchy in some ways that a lot of people aren't able to talk about now. And then what does participation look like while still keeping certain structures in place that may be helpful too. So anyway, that was very provocative for me because I'm kind of in that question right now in my work. So
yeah. And I think so much of what's happening in our country is the backlash against, what Wilbur would have called the green meme, this kind of flattening of all of our differences to make space for difference, but without a sense that there's any kind of hierarchy of value, or that one perspective may be more inclusive and open to revision and transformation than another, and that we have to be careful, right, to minimize the damage that people can do in a very flat setting, because no one's willing to take responsibility. I think, it's part of that developmental move that Kegan talks about, to reject the stage that's immediately previous in order to emerge from it. And to have relativistic thinking is a great advantage. But taken too far, it ends up spinning in circles, especially if you're in an organization. We work with a number of organizations that intentionally flatten themselves, remove titles and roles, and they're struggling terribly. And what would be really valuable for them is to see the excesses, the overuses, if we think of it from a polarity navigation point of view, and rediscover what's the healthy benefit of a hierarchy, not of domination, but of actualization, which is exactly what Pope Francis is trying to do, create a hierarchy of actualization, so that people at every level of the organization, the community, can participate at the level at which they can participate. Yeah, it's a real shift, I think, that involves imagination, people willing to be circumspect, about the excesses of, this kind of reform, or what do we call it? The transforming mindset. No, give me the language, Shakila.
I'm missing.
Growth?
I'm forgetting now too. But yeah, I know what you mean. Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
How
Yeah.
about others? Moving into that direction of self-transforming. On the way, we enter into that relativistic mindset where everything's all good. I can appreciate diversity. I'm tolerant. I'm open. But I might even be attracted to it. But the fear of setting oneself up in a power relationship is so great. And the rejection of all the colonialism, which is appropriate to reject, leaves us with a gap, a vacuum. In fact, Julie, I'd be really interested in your voice in on this as you work, in those kinds of settings, how you see the relationship between hierarchy and participation in some of the settings in which you work. Would you be willing to say a word about that?
I'm usually so shy at this, David, but here I am. Yes, I'm really, really, really appreciative of hearing all of this. It's so resonant and amazing. And yeah, I think one of the things that happened in our group, and a lot of it was talk about women as well, I think this conversation almost between hierarchy or flattening, what I've really heard is the work going from that worldview of hierarchy. And as you said, it's no small thing to then have people come in and be sitting in circles. But if we take it one step further, you did mention about that this was part of Indigenous culture, like that storytelling and all of that. It's almost like having the pyramid go this way and then flipping it. It's still of the same consciousness, but we've got one stage and you've opened up this next stage. And I think then we're going to get to a place where we go back to, thanks to all the neurobiology stuff that's coming out now with neuroscience and the feminine, that actually we're going back to the original teachings of human design, where we wouldn't be debating hierarchy as if it's hierarchy or flat. Those are almost made up words from the hierarchy. So we're rejecting power upside and down. But if we just go back to, I love what you just said about from a paradigm of dominization to one of actualization, then we'll get to a place, hopefully right now we're having to get out of a paradigm, right? But then we go, what is the design that's back to our original instructions? And then it just is, we already are complex. We already are wired for interdependence and working together. So it's almost like as a collective, what I'm hearing is if we could just add that extra bit of as a collective, we're actually, it's a little bit like addicts, treating addicts as though they have to learn how to undo themselves. But we have a cultural design that predictably created addiction. And I think that's where we're getting with the Indigenous. So that's where I go in a way, is I've been so grateful now having the Indigenous, like used to do this work to this work, but now we have the Indigenous to go, there actually already is a design that's already there. We're not having to inch ourselves out, but this part is so necessary. Anyway.
Oh, we missed. Is anybody else? Nope. We're still on. Let's see. Okay, so we're missing Julie.
David, this
Yeah.
is Tanya.
Hi, Tanya.
As you know, I work in the K-12 sphere, and one thing that really resonated for me, at least in our current world situation was the idea you talked about, that this like kind of behemoth organization of the Catholic Church, that, you know, if it's able to address complexity and make change, you know, to me, that was a hopeful thing to address my context of, you know, large school systems and the need for change in a, you know, a similar vein. So I appreciated that.
Yeah, and Tanya, you know, the conditions to make that change happen have to come from both above and below, or, you know, to sort of
Absolutely.
shift our language to think about
Mhm.
formal and informal authorities. Yeah, yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
How about a few others?
In our group, we also kind of went deep into the question of the hierarchy flattening, and also how that's shaping the dynamic, and especially in the 3 round conversations and the personal sharing, how vulnerable people willing to go within a hierarchical structure. So I'm glad that also resonate with other groups. And I have also another question about more the 3rd round, the noticing, meaning making. And in my experience working in Catholic higher ed, and we have a very diverse population that David would be familiar with, that people coming from different cultural faith backgrounds. And sometimes in that 3rd round, the conversation can be a little inconsistent, given that people coming from using different sets of languages or different understanding of the commonality in that way can be helpful.
Mm.
And also, I think more of the personal practice of sitting back and observing the bigger picture, and that kind of personal practice and discipline or formation coming into this kind of conversation would make a difference. And do you have any insights in a context where people may be more familiar with that kind of like practice of observing bigger picture, meaning making, or using religious language like the spirit, how the spirit is moving?
Well, in fact, CY, there's 2 things that you said I wanted to just underscore. In the 3rd round, the capacity for an individual to take a step back from one's individual experience and to see and perceive what's going on for the group as a whole is a shift. For those of us who have had group dynamics formation or gone through systems kind of formation at a deep level, to be able to not just project from one's own personal perspective, but to actually name a systemic or group dynamic can be incredibly valuable. And then to sort of check it with the perspectives of others, to really, in a sense, confirm or validate, is this really what our group was saying? In a sense, it's to test out, you know, the movement of the group. Was there a consensus? Was there a convergence? Did we each share a sense of the same energy of peace, of excitement, of, in a sense, some charge that felt like it's moving us forward together? Or did we feel divided? Another thing that's important about the 3rd round is, as you say, to be able to step back, but also to express what's going on in the group in creative forms, to use presentational ways of knowing, to use metaphors, to use art, to embody it in some way. It depends on your group, of course, and we're trying to do this with some folks who are not used to this kind of creativity and expression. But when they do it, it really unlocks something for them, because it's moving from what's in the mind to the body. It brings up, you know, this sensitivity to energy and purpose and things that we consider very spiritual, even if you're not a religious person. So the 3rd round is really, it needs practice. It needs practice to do it well. But when part of a larger dynamic, where lots of small groups are pondering the same question on behalf of an organization, in the plenary, often it's like you see the parts in the whole beginning to take shape right in front of you, and a really skillful facilitation can help kind of give shape to what emerges in a way that can be very meaningful to the organization. So lots more to share about that, but also lots to learn. I feel like we're really learning at this point how to do it and how to do it well. We've got about 5 minutes left. Anybody who hasn't had a chance to speak who'd like to? Ellen?
Yeah. David. Hello, Father David.
Hello there. Nice to see you.
Good to see you as well. Good to see you as well. And to be here with you and everyone learning about your great work. We had a wonderful conversation about how just this approach created a real longing for the ability to have these kinds of relationships and inquiries in other parts of our lives, right? What I was struck by was how the context of spirituality that is so alive in your world is being invited to help create a more dynamic and complex experience for everybody. And I'm wondering how we could create a similar context with similar language and values elsewhere, right?
Yeah.
Because as you acknowledged early on, the church is a very specific context, and the Catholic Church is even more specific, right? In terms of its values and views on spirituality and power and hierarchy, that is being mobilized and into this dynamic conversation. And I'm just wondering how, for those of us who don't live in a similar place where our values are so present, either, in reality or in espoused versus realized, right? Where do we find the permission for this work, right? Because I think there's a certain amount of acceptance for these kinds of dialogues or conversations where you are. Because as priests and as clerics, for example, you do engage in spiritual conversations with each other all the time, I would imagine.
Less so than you might think.
Yeah, well, at least okay, now I'm showing my assumptions and biases, right? But I would assume there's a level of comfort if there's the right relationships for being open to these kinds of, well, anyway, I'm going to stop talking and just let you know that's what's circulating in my mind right now. So,
and I would imagine it's a question that others have in mind as well. So, I think the giving permission to ourselves to actually create and offer liberating spaces for people within our own contexts to have meaningful conversations about things like purpose and values, and about the kind of underlying direction of our callings, right? What have brought us to the work that we're doing? Like, why do we do what we do? When we start having that conversation, you start to unlock for people a sense that their whole person is being invited, right, to work, and not just to work in a way that's instrumental and commodity oriented, but to engage purposefully with the energy of our lives in relationship with each other, to do so for something that's bigger than ourselves. It I think is very much about, in that self-authoring way, giving ourselves permission to take that initiative, to start the conversation by asking the deep questions of other people that we ourselves know that we need to explore and ponder, right? We're living in a moment where we're moving through a change of epochs, and it's frightening, and it's causing regression for people to have space to talk about their hopes and their fears, to allow, our language to, in a sense, be less sectarian, but without losing the kind of spiritual depth and richness, right, that's available to us. This is where poetry and the arts are so helpful to inspire us to connect to things in a way that's not just simply rational, because the rational is not going to be the answer to, the next stage of our evolution. It's not going to be the answer to how we transform our world and kind of manage the climate collapse. We're going to have to engage as whole people. This is where my friends, for instance, Frederic Laloux and Otto Scharmer and their colleagues are really, I think, doing very creative work to bring the multiple intelligences of ourselves, including the spiritual intelligence, into interaction in organizational environments and in social spaces, so that we're not getting caught up in creeds and differences between what we believe and all that, but we're nonetheless operating in a deeply, deeply spiritual way, an embodied way. So anyway, that would be my response. I know we're at time.
Yes, we are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I just want to say thank you. Thank you very much.
We want to say thank you. Absolutely. Please join me in thanking David for, a really wonderful talk. And we're happy that you could come and be part of the Generative Learning and Complexity Laboratories speaker series. And so thank you to all of you who joined us today. If you want more information about the lab, we have a website. Young Hyun has been doing a wonderful job of updating it. This talk will make its way to the website after we've had a chance to get it uploaded. And so you can also see it. And please join the mailing list if you're not already on it, so that you can hear about our the speakers that we'll have coming in the fall. So thank you so much, David. This has been wonderful. It's great to see you, and it's really fun to have you here and to learn more about the incredible work that you're doing. I really appreciate it.
Listen, if you're praying people, please keep the conclave in your prayers, because the direction of all of this work will so much depend on the next formal authority, in that particular role. And, as you know, we're all living at a time where every one of our sort of our agency, our hearts, our hands, our heads, everything has to kind of be in the right relationship in order to make a difference moving forward. So may that be the case. It's great to be with you all.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Thank you so much.